Move her. Mr. Whitmore paid more. The sentence landed across the VIP cabin like a hoot his gavel. Conversations stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. The soft hum of the Atlantic Elite ferry suddenly felt distant beneath the weight of those 6 words. Naomi Brooks slowly lifted her eyes from the tablet resting on her lap. She had been reviewing a merger document while the vessel cut through the gray waters between Boston and Portland at nearly 40 miles per hour. Now every gaze in the premium lounge seemed fixed on her. Standing over her was Karen Whitmore, Director of VIP Guest Relations, dressed in a navy blazer with a gold company badge pinned neatly above her heart. Her smile looked professional from a distance. Up close, it looked like a warning. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to relocate to another section," Karen said. Naomi glanced toward the digital placard above her seat. It clearly displayed her name. Seat 1A. VIP Platinum. Confirmed. She looked back at Karen. "Is there a problem with my reservation?" Her voice remained calm. Not defensive. Not angry. Just steady. Karen folded her hands. Mr. Whitmore is one of our most valued guests. There appears to have been a seating adjustment. A man standing several feet away adjusted the cuff of his expensive gray jacket and smirked. Richard Whitmore. Mid-50s. Wealthy. Confident. The kind of man accustomed to watching doors open before he reached them. He carried himself as though every room belonged to him. "I'm sure she understands," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "These premium accommodations are in high demand." Naomi studied him for a moment. Then she looked back at Karen. "I purchased this seat 3 weeks ago." Karen's expression tightened. "And we're grateful for your business. But we'll upgrade your dining package and provide complimentary amenities." Around them, the lounge remained silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Atlantic Ocean in shades of steel blue. Leather seats. Marble tables. Fresh orchids. Everything about the room suggested luxury. Yet beneath the polished surfaces, something uglier had begun to surface. Naomi sat alone in a simple black sweater, dark jeans, and white sneakers. No jewelry beyond a silver watch. No designer logos. No entourage. Nothing about her appearance announced that her personal net worth exceeded $4 billion. Nothing revealed that by the end of the day she would control the very company operating this ferry. And nobody in the room knew it. Karen extended a hand toward the rear cabin. "If you'll follow me." Naomi remained seated. Not defiant. Not stubborn. Simply still. Like an anchor dropped into deep water. Richard laughed quietly. "This doesn't need to become a scene." Across the lounge, a young woman lowered her phone from where she had been taking photos of the ocean. Maya Torres. 24. Travel blogger. Curious eyes. She looked from Richard to Naomi, sensing something wasn't right. An older black veteran seated near the window slowly removed his reading glasses. A retired teacher traveling with her granddaughter leaned forward in concern. The room had begun to shift. Naomi closed the cover of her tablet. "Can you verify my ticket again?" she asked. Karen sighed. "Ma'am, the issue isn't your ticket." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Then what exactly is the issue?" For the briefest moment, Karen hesitated. Only a second. But it was enough. Richard stepped closer. "The issue is simple. Some seats are intended for certain guests." The words hung in the air. Sharp. Deliberate. Several passengers exchanged glances. Maya frowned. Even Karen appeared uncomfortable with how openly he had said it. Yet she didn't correct him. She didn't challenge him. She simply stood there. Naomi had seen that look before. The careful smile. The polite language hiding an ugly assumption. She had seen it at 19 when a marina manager questioned whether she could afford a boat tour. She had seen it at 27 when investors asked whose company she represented rather than realizing it was her company. Different faces. Same message. You don't belong here. The ferry continued forward. Waves rolled against the hull. Somewhere overhead, a gull cried against the wind. But inside the VIP cabin, the atmosphere had changed completely. I paid for this seat, Naomi said. Karen's smile vanished. Mr. Whitmore has priority accommodations. According to what policy? Naomi asked. Karen didn't answer immediately. Richard did. Look, let's not waste everyone's afternoon. He pointed toward the rear section. There are plenty of seats back there. The veteran near the window frowned deeper. Maya slowly unlocked her phone. The teacher shook her head. And for the first time, Karen's confidence seemed less certain. Naomi looked around the room. Not at the people judging her. Not at Richard. Not even at Karen. She looked at the passengers quietly watching. Then she returned her gaze to the woman standing over her. Her expression never changed. I'd like to see the policy, she said. The silence that followed felt heavier than the ocean outside. And somewhere far beyond the ferry, inside a glass conference room overlooking Manhattan, a legal team waited for a final signature that would change everything. Karen Whitmore stood motionless beside seat 1A, her professional smile growing thinner with every passing second. She had expected compliance. She had expected embarrassment. What she had not expected was resistance delivered so calmly that it forced everyone around her to start paying attention. Naomi Brooks remained seated, one hand resting lightly on her closed tablet. The ocean drifted past beyond the glass walls of the VIP cabin, gray waves stretching toward the horizon beneath a cloudy New England sky. The ferry continued its route as though nothing unusual had happened. Inside the lounge, however, the atmosphere felt charged. Richard Whitmore cleared his throat and adjusted the expensive watch peeking from beneath his sleeve. He looked around the room, searching for support, but found fewer approving faces than he expected. The retired teacher near the window exchanged a glance with her granddaughter. Maya Torres kept her phone lowered but remained alert. Even a businessman reviewing spreadsheets on a laptop had stopped pretending not to notice. Karen straightened her blazer. Ma'am, I am trying to resolve this professionally. Naomi nodded. So am me. The answer landed harder than an argument would have. Karen's jaw tightened. Richard. Step closer. Look, this is becoming unnecessary. Naomi turned toward him. Then perhaps you can explain why I am being asked to leave a seat that was assigned to me. Richard opened his mouth, then paused. He had confidence. He had status. But he did not have an answer. Instead, he offered a shrug. Sometimes adjustments happen. Naomi held his gaze. Interesting. You travel often. Adjustments usually involve policies, records, or operational issues. Not preferences. Several passengers glanced toward Richard. The word preferences seemed to linger in the air longer than anyone expected. Karen quickly intervened. This is not personal. Naomi looked up at her. Then it should be easy to explain. Silence followed. A few seconds. Then a few more. The room began drawing its own conclusions. Maya noticed it first. Karen was speaking confidently, but not specifically. Every answer felt incomplete. Every explanation seemed to avoid the actual question. Across the cabin, the retired veteran folded his newspaper. He had spent 24 years in the United States Navy. He recognized tension when he saw it. More importantly, he recognized when authority depended on assumptions rather than facts. If her ticket is valid, he said quietly, Why move her? Nobody answered him. The question hung over the lounge like a spotlight. Richard looked annoyed. Karen looked uncomfortable. Naomi remained composed. The veteran nodded slightly to himself. That told him everything he needed to know. Meanwhile, Naomi's phone rested silently beside her tablet. She did not touch it. She did not need to. Earlier that morning, before arriving at the terminal, she had received confirmation that the acquisition process was entering its final stage. Teams in New York, Boston, and Manhattan were reviewing the last documents. Attorneys were preparing signatures. Financial analysts were finalizing transfers. Within hours, Atlantic Elite Lines would have new ownership. Nobody aboard this ferry knew it. Not Karen. Not Richard. Not even the executives currently attending meetings onshore. Naomi had deliberately chosen to travel anonymously. No assistants. No security detail. No luxury convo. Just a woman taking a seat she had legally purchased. Yet somehow that had become a problem. Richard suddenly laughed. It sounded forced. You know, most people would have moved by now. Naomi met his eyes. Most people are not me. The answer drew a few surprised expressions from nearby passengers. Maya raised an eyebrow. For the first time, she noticed something different about Naomi. Confidence. Not arrogance. Not entitlement. Something deeper. The kind of certainty that did not require validation. The kind of certainty built over decades. Karen reached for a tablet attached to her belt and tapped through several screens. Her movements appeared increasingly hurried. There seems to be an issue in the system, she said. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What issue? Karen hesitated. The records are being reviewed. By whom? Naomi asked. Another pause. Another missing answer. Maya noticed the pattern again. The businessman with the laptop noticed it too. The teacher noticed it. One by one, passengers who had initially assumed Karen was correct began questioning what they were witnessing. Outside, a horn echoed across the water. The ferry was approaching the midpoint of its journey. Inside, Karen's certainty continued to erode. Richard crossed his arms. Why are we still discussing this? Naomi answered before Karen could. Because fairness usually requires discussion. Richard rolled his eyes. Fairness has nothing to do with it. The moment the words left his mouth, several heads turned toward him. He seemed to realize his mistake immediately. But it was too late. Maya slowly unlocked her phone again. She was not recording. Not yet. She was simply paying attention. Sometimes that mattered more. Naomi glanced briefly through the panoramic windows. Far in the distance, the coastline appeared as a faint gray line beneath the clouds. Then she looked back toward Karen. One last time, she said calmly. Please show me the policy that allows you to remove a confirmed passenger from a paid VIP seat. Karen stared at her. Richard stared at her. The room stared at her. And in that moment, neither of them realized that somewhere inside a Manhattan conference room, a final approval notification had just appeared on a screen bearing one name in bold letters. Naomi Brooks. Karen Whitmore stared at the screen in her hand as though it might suddenly produce the answer she needed. It did not. The small device reflected only her growing uncertainty. Around here, the passengers in the VIP cabin were no longer passive observers. The atmosphere had shifted. People who had arrived expecting a quiet afternoon crossing now found themselves watching something far more revealing. Not a disagreement over a seat. A test of character. Richard Whitmore seemed determined not to notice the change. He remained standing near seat 1A, one hand resting casually on the leather headrest as though possession alone made it his. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Everyone here can see what is happening." The irony passed through the room like a cold draft. Several passengers exchanged glances. Yes, they could see what was happening. That was precisely the problem. Naomi Brooks folded her hands calmly in her lap. She had not raised her voice once. She had not insulted anyone. She had not demanded special treatment. Yet somehow she was still the person being asked to move. The businessman with the laptop finally closed it. "I am curious," he said. "If there is a system issue, why is the passenger with the confirmed seat being relocated instead of the passenger requesting the change?" Karen looked toward him. "Sir, I assure you we are handling the situation." That was not an answer, he replied. A few quiet nods followed. Maya Torres noticed Karen's shoulders stiffen. She noticed Richard becoming increasingly impatient. More importantly, she noticed Naomi remaining completely composed. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the panoramic windows. Gray clouds stretched across the Atlantic sky, turning the ocean into a sheet of silver. Inside, the tension continued building. Karen tapped through her device again. Then again. Finally she looked up. "There appears to be a discrepancy in the VIP manifest." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "A discrepancy involving only my reservation?" Karen hesitated. "The system is still updating." Naomi nodded slowly. "Interesting." Richard sighed dramatically. "Why are we wasting time debating technology?" Naomi looked at him. "Because facts matter." Richard laughed. "Not everything requires an investigation." "It does when someone is being removed from a seat they paid for," Naomi replied. The answer drew another ripple of agreement from nearby passengers. Richard's confidence seemed to falter for the first time. "Only slightly. But enough." Maya studied Naomi carefully. Something about her felt familiar. Not her face exactly. Her presence. The way she spoke. The way she never rushed. The way every answer sounded measured rather than emotional. Maya had interviewed entrepreneurs for her travel channel before. She had spoken with executives, investors, founders. Naomi carried herself like someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of people. Yet she sat alone in simple clothes with no indication of status. It made no sense. The retired veteran leaned forward. "Ma'am," he said to Karen. "How long have you worked for this company?" Karen seemed surprised by the question. 7 years. He nodded. "Then you know company policies pretty well." "Of course." "Can you point to the policy she violated?" Silence. The rain continued tapping against the glass. Somewhere deeper in the vessel, a horn sounded softly. Karen opened her mouth. Closed it. Then looked toward Richard as though hoping he might rescue her. It did not. Instead, he grew defensive. She does not need to violate a policy. Sometimes accommodations are made for premium guests. The businessman frowned. She is sitting in the premium section. Richard's expression darkened. An utter uncomfortable silence settled over the cabin. Naomi watched it all unfold without moving. Years earlier she might have felt anger, frustration, the urge to prove herself. Experience had taught her something different. People revealed themselves when given enough time. The truth rarely needed assistance. It only needed space. Maya glanced down at her phone and quickly searched the company operating the ferry. Atlantic Elite Lines. Several articles appeared. One headline caught her. Attention. Acquisition negotiations entering final stage. She opened the story. The article mentioned a consortium led by an unnamed investor. The details were limited. Most names remained confidential. Maya looked up at Naomi again. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. She could not explain it. Not yet. Karin suddenly straightened. Relief flashed across her face. I have contacted operations, she announced. They are reviewing the matter. Richard smiled immediately. Good. Then we can finally move on. Naomi looked toward Karen. How long will the review take? A few minutes. Naomi nodded. Then we wait. The simplicity of the answer seemed to frustrate Richard more than resistance ever could. He glanced around the room and noticed something he clearly did not like. The audience was no longer on his side. The teacher. The businessman. The veteran. Maya. One by one, people had stopped viewing Naomi as the problem. Instead, they had started questioning the people demanding her removal. Karin sensed it too. Her professional confidence had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Every explanation raised new questions. Every attempt at authority seemed weaker than the last. Then Naomi's phone vibrated once against the table. A single notification. Nothing more. She glanced down briefly. Her expression did not change. But far away in Manhattan, inside a conference room overlooking the Hudson River, another signature had just been added to a document worth billions of dollars. And with that signature, the balance of power aboard the ferry moved one step closer to changing forever. The notification disappeared from Naomi Brooks's screen almost as quickly as it had appeared. Anyone watching would have assumed it was an ordinary message. A calendar reminder. An email. A weather alert. Naomi simply placed the phone face down beside her tablet and returned her attention to the people standing around her. That alone seemed to frustrate Richard Whitmore. He had spent the last several minutes expecting her patience to crack. Instead, the opposite kept happening. The calmer she remained, the more uncomfortable everyone else became. Karin Whitmore glanced toward the entrance of the VIP cabin. She was waiting for help. Waiting for someone from operations to arrive and validate the decision she had already made. The problem was that no one had arrived yet. The rain outside grew heavier. Small rivers of water traced paths across the enormous windows overlooking the Atlantic. Inside, the silence felt almost louder than the storm. Maya Torres continued reading articles on her phone. Something about the acquisition story would not leave her alone. Atlantic Elite Lines had been negotiating for months. Analistas described the buyer as one of the most influential investors in transportation and logistics. The article mentioned a reputation for rebuilding struggling companies from the inside. Maya looked up at Naomi again. The resemblance was not physical. It was behavioral. The confidence. The paciencia. The sense that she was observing everything while revealing almost nothing. Excuse me, Maya said carefully. Several heads turned toward her. Can I ask a question? Naomi nodded politely. Of course. Have you traveled this route before? Maya asked. Richard rolled his eyes. What difference does that make? Maya ignored him. Naomi smiled faintly. Many times. Business? Maya asked. Sometimes. The answer seemed ordinary. Yet Maya found herself more curious than before. The businessman who had closed his laptop leaned forward. You seem remarkably calm considering everything that has happened. Naomi looked at him. Getting upset would not change the facts. The businessman nodded slowly. The retired veteran smiled. That is probably the smartest thing anyone has said all afternoon. A few passengers laughed quietly. Richard did not. Karin did not. Their control of the situation was slipping away one conversation at a time. Karin finally received a message on her device. Relief flashed across her face. Operations has responded, she announced. Several passengers immediately looked toward her. Richard straightened his posture. Naomi remained seated. Karen scanned the message. Then scanned it again. Her expression changed. The relief disappeared almost instantly. Confusion replaced it. Wow. Richard asked. Karen hesitated. The manifest is still under review. Richard stared at her. That is the response? They are investigating discrepancies. Richard's face tightened. This should have been resolved already. Naomi quietly observed the exchange. The veteran noticed something too. Karen was no longer speaking with certainty. Earlier she had sounded like someone enforcing policy. Now she sounded like someone trying to justify a decision after the fact. There was a difference. And everyone could hear it. The teacher near the window finally spoke. Young lady, she said to Karen, I taught high school civics for 37 years. Whenever someone avoids a simple answer, it usually means the answer is uncomfortable. Several passengers smiled. Karen looked away. Maya could practically feel the mood changing throughout the lounge. At first people had assumed Naomi was somehow responsible for the conflict. Now they were beginning to question the people who had created it. Richard seemed to realize the same thing. His voice grew sharper. This is becoming absurd. You have important commitments. Naomi looked at him. So do I. Something about the answer made Richard pause. For the first time, he studied her carefully. Not her clothes. Not her seat assignment. Her face. Her posture. Her confidence. He seemed to be searching his memory. Trying to place her. Trying to understand why she appeared completely unafraid. Across the Atlantic, storms often arrived gradually. A distant cloud. A subtle shift in the wind. Then suddenly the entire horizon changed. The atmosphere inside the VIP cabin felt remarkably similar. Nobody could identify exactly when the balance had begun shifting. Yet everyone could feel it happening. Naomi's phone vibrated again. 11. She glanced down. Another notification. This time the message contained only 3 words. Final approval completed. Naomi locked the screen without reacting. But somewhere inside a conference room overlooking Manhattan, attorneys were already shaking hands. Financial institutions were processing transfers. Executives were receiving confidential emails. Ownership of Atlantic Elite Lines had officially changed. The information simply had not reached this ferry yet. Karen suddenly looked toward Naomi. Ma'am, until operations completes its review, I am asking for your cooperation. Naomi met her eyes. I have cooperated the entire time. Karen opened her mouth but found no argument. Because it was true. Naomi had remained respectful. Patient. Calm. Every witness in the room had seen it. The retired veteran nodded. She has not caused a single problem. The businessman agreed. Neither has anyone explained why she is being moved. Maya noticed Richard becoming increasingly uneasy. His confidence was beginning to look less like authority and more like assumption. Then the cabin doors opened. A junior employee stepped inside carrying a company tablet. He looked nervous. Very nervous. His eyes moved from Karen to Richard and finally to Naomi. For a brief moment, he froze. Then he swallowed hard and approached Karen. Ma'am, he said quietly. Operations needs to speak with you immediately. Karen frowned. About what? The employee glanced toward Naomi again. His hesitation lasted only a second. But everyone saw it. And in that moment, every passenger in the VIP cabin sensed the same thing. Whatever happened next was about to change everything. The young employee's nervous expression spread through the cabin faster than any announcement could have. Karen Whitmore immediately stepped toward him, lowering her voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from noticing the tension. "What is so urgent?" she asked. The employee swallowed. "Operations requested immediate contact. They said it cannot wait." Karen extended her hand. "Give me the tablet." He hesitated. Used for a moment. Then he handed it over. Naomi Brooks watched quietly from seat 1A. She did not lean forward. She did not try to see the screen. She simply observed. The same way she had observed every detail since stepping into the VIP lounge. Richard Whitmore folded his arms. "Finally," he said. "This whole thing should have been settled an hour ago." Nobody corrected him, though less than 20 minutes had actually passed. Time had begun moving differently inside the cabin. Every conversation seemed longer. Every silence seemed heavier. Karen reviewed the tablet. Her eyes moved quickly across the display. Then she stopped. Her expression changed. The confidence she had fought to maintain all afternoon flickered for a second. The veteran noticed it immediately. Maya Torres noticed it too. So did the businessman with the laptop. People often revealed more through their faces than their words. Karen quickly locked the screen. "There is no issue," she said. The employee looked surprised. "Ma'am, they specifically instructed," Karen cut him off. "I said there is no issue." The room became quiet again. Not because people believed her. Because they did not. The employee looked uncomfortable. "Operations requested verification of passenger information." Richard sighed loudly. "Then verify it already." Naomi looked toward the employee. "Verification of which passenger?" The young man glanced at Karen before answering. "Sea uno A." Several heads turned toward Naomi. Karen's expression tightened further. Maya felt her curiosity intensify. Why would operations suddenly request verification of a passenger they were supposedly removing? The question did not make sense. Neither did the answers. Outside, the rain had begun to ease. Pale sunlight pushed through the clouds, casting silver reflections across the water. Inside, the atmosphere remained stormy. Karen handed the tablet back. "Everything is under control." The veteran smiled faintly. That phrase usually means the opposite. A few passengers chuckled. Richard did not. Karen did not. Naomi simply sat still. The employee looked as though he wanted to say more. Finally he leaned toward Karen again. "Ma'am, they asked me to confirm whether Ms. Brooks is still on board." The words landed softly. Yet they changed everything. Maya's eyes widened. The businessman looked up. Even the teacher stopped pretending to read her magazine. Karen immediately responded. "She is on board." Then they asked for confirmation that she has not been relocated. This time the silence felt different. Sharper. More dangerous. Richard frowned. Why would operations care where she is sitting? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Except perhaps Naomi. And Naomi was not talking. Maya stared at Naomi's calm expression. The more she listened, the less this felt like a normal customer dispute. Operations was not asking about Richard. They were not asking about VIP accommodations. They were not asking about scheduling. They were asking specifically about Naomi Brooks. The name repeated itself in Maya's mind. Naomi Brooks. Naomi Brooks. Somewhere she had heard it before. Then suddenly she remembered. 2 months earlier she had watched a business conference online while editing travel content. One of the keynote speakers had been a black female billionaire discussing infrastructure investments across North America. The audience had given her a standing ovation. Maya's eyes widened further. She quietly opened her phone and began searching. Richard noticed her tapping. "What are you doing?" Maya looked up. "Research." "About what?" "About her." Richard laughed. "She is a passenger." Maya did not answer. Instead she continued scrolling. Photographs appeared. News articles. Financial publications. Conference footage. Then she froze. The woman on her screen wore a business suit instead of a sweater. Her hair was styled differently. The setting was different. But the face was unmistakable. Maya's heart skipped. She looked from the screen to Naomi. Then back to the screen. Then back to Naomi again. The realization hit her like a wave. She did not speak. Not yet. Across the cabin, Karen's phone suddenly rang. She answered immediately. Karen Whitmore speaking. Her posture straightened. Then slowly changed. The color began draining from her face. "Yes," she said. "She is here." A pause. "No, she has not moved." Another pause. This one much longer. Every passenger watched. Even Richard. Karen listened without speaking. Then finally she whispered, "I understand." She ended the call. The room waited. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Karen looked directly at Naomi for several seconds. Whatever she had just heard clearly mattered. A great deal. But before she could speak, Maya slowly stood from her seat holding her phone in trembling hands. She looked at Naomi. Then at the passengers around her. Then back at the screen. The expression on her face said everything. Before a single word left her mouth. The cabin remained perfectly still as Maya Torres stared at the screen in her hand. Her pulse raced. The article she had opened was less than 24 hours old. The headline featured a photograph taken at a transportation investment summit in New York. The woman standing at the center of the stage wore a navy business suit and addressed a room full of executives, governors, and industry leaders. The name beneath the photograph matched the name assigned to seat 1A. Naomi Brooks. Founder. Investor. Billionaire. Maya looked up slowly. Naomi sat exactly where she had been since the confrontation began. Calm. Patient. Unmoved. The contrast between the image on the screen and the woman quietly sitting in a sweater somehow made the revelation even more shocking. "What is it?" the retired teacher asked softly. Maya swallowed. "I think I know who she is." Richard Whitmore immediately laughed. "Everyone suddenly thinks they know something." Maya ignored him. Her eyes never left Naomi. "You are Naomi Brooks, aren't you?" The question drifted across the cabin. Several passengers turned toward Naomi. Karen Whitmore froze completely. The young employee near the entrance looked down at the floor. Naomi met Maya's gaze. For a moment she said nothing. Then she offered a small smile. "That is my name." The room seemed to exhale all at once. Maya looked back at the article. The investor. Silence. The transportation investor. More silence. Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" Maya raised her phone. "She owns companies across the country. Shipping. Infrastructure. Logistics. Rail. Ports." Richard rolled his eyes. That does not explain anything. But his confidence no longer sounded convincing. The businessman who had been observing quietly reached for his own phone and began searching. A few seconds later his eyebrows rose. Then the retired veteran checked. Then the teacher. One by one, screens illuminated around the cabin. One by one, expressions changed. Naomi did not stop them. She simply sat there while strangers discovered pieces of a story she had never volunteered. Karen looked trapped between two realities. The reality she had assumed when Naomi first boarded. And the reality unfolding in front of her now. The phone call she had received moments earlier suddenly made far more sense. The employee cleared his throat. Operations requested confirmation because corporate offices have been trying to reach this vessel. Nobody spoke. It continued carefully. They said there was an executive-level notification connected to passenger Naomi Brooks. Richard laughed again, but this time the sound felt forced. Executive-level notification? That could mean anything. The businessman looked up from his phone. Actually, it probably does not. Richard turned toward him. And why is that? The businessman rotated his screen. An acquisition article filled the display. Because Atlantic Elite Lines has been negotiating a major ownership transaction for months. The cabin grew quiet again. Outside, sunlight broke through the clouds and scattered across the ocean like liquid silver. The storm was ending. Inside the lounge, another kind of storm was only beginning. Karen stepped toward Naomi. Her voice softened noticeably. Ms. Brooks, perhaps there has been some misunderstanding. The veteran almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the change in tone was impossible to miss. 20 minutes earlier Karen had spoken with authority. Now she sounded cautious. Respectful. Almost nervous. Naomi looked at her. What part was misunderstood? Karen hesitated. The question was simple. The answer was not. Richard suddenly inserted himself into the conversation. This is getting ridiculous. We are acting like she owns the company. The words echoed through the cabin. Then something unexpected happened. The young employee near the entrance closed his eyes briefly. As though he already knew what came next. Maya noticed. So did Naomi. So did the businessman. Richard kept talking. Maybe she is wealthy. Maybe she has investments. Good for her. That does not change company policy. Naomi folded her hands. I agree. Richard smiled for the first time in several minutes. Exactly. Naomi's expression never changed. The problem is that nobody has shown me the policy. A few passengers smiled. Richard's brief victory vanished instantly. The teacher nodded. That remains true. The businessman nodded as well. Very true. Karen looked increasingly uncomfortable. Her phone vibrated again. Then again. Then a third time. Messages were arriving faster than she could read them. Across the ferry, department managers were receiving similar notifications. Supervisors were checking emails. Executives onshore were joining conference calls. Information was spreading through the company like electricity. The vessel had not reached its destination yet. But news was already moving ahead of it. The employee's tablet suddenly chimed. He glanced down. His eyes widened. Karen immediately noticed. What is it? She asked. The employee looked uncertain. Operations just sent another message. Read it. He hesitated. Every passenger watched. Every eye remained fixed on him. Finally he swallowed hard and looked at the screen. Operations requests immediate preparation for an executive transition announcement. The words landed like a thunderclap. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Richard frowned. Executive transition? The employee nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Maya looked from the tablet to Naomi. The businessman did the same. The veteran did the same. Even Karen seemed unable to look anywhere else. Because for the first time since the confrontation began, everyone aboard the ferry was starting to understand the same thing. The woman they had spent the afternoon questioning was not becoming important. She had been important the entire time. The words executive transition announcement continued echoing through the VIP cabin long after the employee stopped speaking. Nobody seemed quite sure how to react. The ferry moved steadily across the Atlantic, cutting through calm water now illuminated by late afternoon sunlight, but inside the lounge time felt suspended. Richard Whitmore stared at the young employee as though waiting for him to correct himself. "You must be mistaken," he finally said. The employee looked down at the tablet. "No, sir." The message came directly from corporate operations. Richard forced a laugh. "Executive transitions do not happen in the middle of a ferry ride." "Apparently this one does," the businessman replied quietly. Several passengers smiled. Richard did not. Karen Whitmore remained frozen beside seat 1A. Her phone continued vibrating every few minutes. New messages. New emails. New instructions. Each notification seemed to drain more confidence from her face. Earlier she had spoken like someone controlling the situation. Now she looked like someone struggling to understand it. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she had been from the beginning. Calm. Composed. Patient. She sat with the quiet confidence of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Maya Torres watched her carefully. The more she compared the woman in front of her to the articles on her phone, the more certain she became. This was not simply an investor. This was one of the most influential transportation executives in the country. Ports. Rail systems. Cargo networks. Shipping terminals. Her companies moved billions of dollars in commerce every year. And somehow she had spent the last half hour being treated like she did not belong in a seat she had legally purchased. The realization made Maya shake her head. The retired teacher leaned toward Naomi. "May I ask you something?" Naomi smiled politely. "Of course. Did you know all of this was happening?" Naomi looked toward the windows for a moment. Sunlight shimmered across the water like scattered silver coins. Then she looked back. "I knew some things were changing today." The answer was truthful. It was also incomplete. The veteran laughed softly. "That sounds like the answer of someone who knows much more than she is saying." Naomi smiled but did not elaborate. Across the cabin, Richard seemed increasingly irritated by every conversation that did not involve him. "This is all speculation," he said. "Nobody has confirmed anything." The businessman raised an eyebrow. Neither did anyone confirm a reason for removing her from the seat. That observation landed hard. Even Karen looked away. The simple truth remained impossible to escape. The conflict had started because assumptions replaced facts. Every passenger now understood it. Every passenger except perhaps Richard. Suddenly the large display screen mounted near the entrance flickered. Normally it showed travel information, weather conditions, and arrival estimates. Now the screen went dark for several seconds. Conversations stopped immediately. Even Karen noticed. The employee looked at his tablet. "That is unusual." Then the display illuminated again. A corporate logo appeared. Atlantic Elite Lines. Beneath it, a message slowly loaded across the screen. Several passengers leaned forward. Richard frowned. Karen stared. The employee swallowed nervously. The message remained incomplete. Use the loading screen. Waiting. Processing. Updating. Yet somehow it commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Naomi glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to the ocean. Maya noticed that. Most people would have been curious. Most people would have stared. Naomi already seemed to know what was coming. That fact unsettled Maya more than anything else. Karin's phone rang again. This time she answered immediately. Karen Whitmore speaking. Her voice sounded noticeably softer than before. She listened for nearly 30 seconds without saying a word. Then her eyes widened. Understood, she whispered. Another pause. Yes. Immediately. She ended the call and simply stood there. Nobody spoke. The veteran finally broke the silence. Would you like to tell the rest of us what is happening? Karin looked toward Naomi. For the first time all afternoon, there was no authority in her expression. No certainty. No assumption. Only apprehension. Corporate leadership is requesting that Ms. Brooks remain exactly where she is. The cabin became silent. Richard blinked. What? Karin continued. They specifically instructed that no changes be made to her seating assignment. Richard stared at her. This is absurd. The teacher shook her head. No. What was absurd happened earlier. Several passengers nodded. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For perhaps the first time that day, he realized he no longer had the room on his side. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The audience had become witnesses. The witnesses had become supporters. And Naomi had never raised her voice once. Then the display screen near the entrance refreshed again. The loading symbol disappeared. New text began appearing line by line. Every passenger turned toward it. Every conversation stopped. Every eye focused on the screen. Because whatever was about to appear had the power to explain everything. The display screen glowed against the polished walls of the VIP cabin, drawing every eye toward it. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked away. Even the sound of the ferry moving through the water seemed distant now. The screen refreshed once. Then again. The Atlantic Elite Line's logo remained centered for several seconds before fading into a new message. Processing corporate update. Please stand by. Richard Whitmore scoffed. This is unbelievable. But his voice lacked conviction. The confidence that had carried him through most of the afternoon was gone. Replaced by uncertainty. Around him, passengers continued watching the screen. Waiting. The retired veteran folded his hands. The teacher lowered her magazine completely. Maya Torres held her phone against her chest, no longer searching, no longer researching. She already knew enough. Naomi Brooks sat quietly beside the window, sunlight reflecting across the water behind her. She seemed almost detached from the tension surrounding her. Not because she did not care. Because she had experienced moments like this before. The cabin faded from her awareness for a moment. The anxious faces. The glowing screen. The nervous employees. They drifted into the background as a different memory surfaced. 26 years earlier. A small ferry terminal in South Carolina. Naomi had been 18. Her mother stood beside her holding 2 tickets purchased with money they had spent months saving. It was supposed to be a celebration. A weekend trip. A simple escape. Instead, they spent nearly an hour being questioned about whether they belonged in the premium waiting area. Naomi still remembered her mother's expression. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of proving yourself over and over again. The exhaustion of watching people decide who you were before learning your name. Her mother never raised her voice that day. She simply stood talla. Later, while they sat overlooking the water, she offered advice Naomi would never forget. Do not spend your life trying to convince people you belong. Spend it building places where nobody has to ask. The words stayed with her. Through college. Through failed deals. Through long nights studying contracts under fluorescent office lights. Through meetings where people assumed she was the assistant instead of the founder. Through every setback. Every dismissal. Every assumption. Years later those words became the foundation of her success. Build something better. Build something larger. Build something impossible to ignore. The memory faded as quickly as it had appeared. Naomi returned to the present. The ferry cabin came back into focus. The screen. The passengers. The sunlight. The tension. She looked out at the Atlantic one more time. The ocean looked calm now. Endless and steady. It reminded her of something else her mother used to say. Storms pass. Character stays. Across the cabin, Karen Whitmore looked increasingly uncomfortable. She checked her phone again. Another message. Then another. The employee standing near the entrance received one as well. Maya noticed both reactions immediately. Information was moving through the company faster than anyone could track. Richard noticed it too. Why does everyone suddenly look nervous? He asked. Nobody answered. Because everyone was asking themselves the same question. The businessman finally spoke. I do not think they are nervous. Richard frowned. Then what are they? The businessman looked toward Naomi. I think they are realizing something. The observation settled over the room. Karen looked away. The employee looked down. Neither argued. Maya watched Naomi carefully. The woman at the center of the entire situation remained the calmest person aboard the vessel. That fact alone felt significant. Then the display screen refreshed again. Several passengers leaned forward. New text appeared. Corporate transition update authorized. Executive communications active. The room became completely silent. Richard stared at the screen. Karen stared at the screen. Even the crew members visible through the glass doorway had stopped moving. Maya felt her heart pounding. Every update seemed to pull the story in the same direction. Every message pointed toward the same conclusion. Yet nobody had said it aloud. Not yet. The teacher slowly shook her head. All of this because someone could not accept a confirmed seat assignment. The veteran nodded. That was never really the issue. Karen heard the comment. So did Richard. Neither responded. Because deep down they understood it too. The seat had only been the beginning. Assumptions had done the rest. The screen flickered one final time. Processing complete. A loading bar appeared beneath the message and began moving steadily across the display. 10%. 20%. 30%. Every passenger watched in complete silence. 40%. 50%. 60%. Karen's phone rang again. She looked at the caller identification and immediately lost what little color remained in her face. 70%. 80%. 90%. The cabin felt frozen in time. Then the loading bar reached 100%. The screen went black. For a brief moment, the reflection of every passenger appeared in the dark glass. Then the next message began loading. And this time, everyone instinctively knew they were about to see the answer to everything. The screen remained black for only a second, but inside the VIP cabin it felt much longer. Every passenger sat frozen in anticipation. The ocean outside sparkled beneath the late afternoon sun, yet nobody was looking through the windows anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the display mounted near the entrance. Then the black screen disappeared. Wheat lettering emerged against a dark blue background. Atlantic Elite Lines Corporate Communications. The message continued loading one line at a time. Authorized executive transition notice. Effective immediately. The cabin became so quiet that the faint hum of the engine seemed unusually loud. Richard Whitmore leaned forward. Karen Whitmore forgot about the phone still in her hand. The young employee near the doorway stared at the screen without blinking. Maya Torres felt her pulse racing. More text appeared. Following completion of acquisition proceedings and board approval, Atlantic Elite Lines officially enters new executive leadership. Several passengers exchanged glances. The businessman slowly lowered his phone. The retired veteran folded his arms. Nobody spoke. Then another line appeared. Please welcome our new Chief Executive Officer. The room collectively held its breath. Even Richard looked uncertain now. The screen paused. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Then the final name appeared in bold letters large enough for everyone in the cabin to read. Naomi Brooks. The reaction was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. Used complete disbelief. Maya covered her mouth. The teacher stared at the screen and then at Naomi and then back at the screen again. The businessman actually laughed once, not because anything was funny, but because reality had suddenly become impossible to ignore. The veteran shook his head slowly. Well, he said quietly. That answers a few questions. Karen looked as though the floor had disappeared beneath her. The phone slipped slightly in her hand. Her carefully maintained professionalism collapsed under the weight of the truth displayed before everyone. Richard simply stared. For several long seconds he did not move at all. The woman he had dismissed. The woman he had pressured to surrender her seat. The woman he had assumed did not belong. She was now the chief executive officer of the company. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Now. The screen refreshed again. Additional text appeared beneath the announcement. All management teams are instructed to cooperate fully with executive transition protocols. Further communications will follow. Thank you for supporting the future of Atlantic Elite Lines. The display returned to the company logo. Nobody looked away. Nobody seemed capable of speaking. Finally Maya broke the silence. Oh my God. It was not said loudly. It did not need to be. The entire room felt the same thing. Karen turned slowly toward Naomi. Ms. Brooks. Her voice cracked slightly. Naomi looked up. Calm as ever. Calm the entire time. Karen swallowed. You are the new chief executive officer? Naomi considered the question for a moment. Then nodded once. As of a few minutes ago, yes. The simplicity of the answer somehow made it even more powerful. There was no speech. No celebration. No dramatic announcement. Used the truth. Richard blinked repeatedly. This is not possible. Naomi finally turned toward him. It appears to be. Richard opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. Every argument he had relied on throughout the afternoon suddenly collapsed under its own weight. Maya watched his expression change. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then realization. Around the cabin, passengers began quietly discussing what had happened. The teacher shook her head. You never told anyone. Naomi smiled faintly. Nobody asked. The veteran laughed. That might be my favorite answer today. A few passengers smiled. Even the young employee near the entrance could not hide his reaction anymore. The tension that had filled the cabin for nearly an hour was transforming into something else. Clarity. Karen remained standing beside seat 1A. Her earlier confidence felt like a distant memory. She looked toward the floor before finally speaking again. I owe you an apology. Naomi studied her for a moment but did not answer immediately. Outside, the coastline had begun appearing on the horizon. The ferry was getting closer to its destination. Inside the cabin, however, something far more important had arrived first. The truce. Naomi looked around the room. At Maya. At the veteran. At the teacher. At the businessman. At every passenger who had witnessed the entire ordeal unfold. Then she returned her gaze to Karen. Her voice remained steady. The problem was never that you did not know who I was. The room became silent once more. Karen lowered her eyes. Richard stared at the floor. Naomi continued. The problem was how you treated someone you thought did not matter. No one argued. No one could. Because every person in the cabin knew she was right. The silence that followed Naomi Brooks's words felt heavier than anything that had happened before. The ferry continued moving toward the coastline, but inside the VIP cabin nobody seemed aware of the journey anymore. Every passenger remained focused on the woman sitting in seat 1A. The woman who had never raised her voice. The woman who had never demanded special treatment. The woman who had quietly become the most powerful person in the company while being told she did not belong. Karen Whitmore looked down at the floor for several seconds before finding the courage to speak again. You are right, she said softly. I did not know who you were. Naomi nodded. That is true. Karen swallowed hard. And I made assumptions. Naomi did not interrupt. Karen continued. I should not have. The admission hung in the air. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Across the cabin, the retired teacher gave a slight nod of approval. Accountability was rare. She respected it when she saw it. Richard Whitmore remained silent. His earlier confidence had disappeared completely. The businessman watched him carefully. It was remarkable how quickly certainty collapsed when facts arrived. Naomi folded her hands and looked around the room. This is not about one seat, she said. Her voice remained calm, but every person listened. If it were only about a seat, we would have solved it an hour ago. Nobody disagreed. The problem began when assumptions became more important than verification. Karen lowered her eyes. The young employee near the entrance listened closely. Maya Torres did the same. Naomi continued. My reservation was confirmed. My identification matched. My seat assignment was valid. Yet none of those facts mattered once certain conclusions had already been reached. The veteran nodded slowly. That is exactly what happened. Several passengers murmured in agreement. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Naomi looked toward him briefly, then returned her attention to the room. What happened here affects more than me. The statement caught everyone's attention. Every customer who walks through our terminals deserves the same standard. Not based on appearance. Not based on assumptions. Based on facts. Karen's phone vibrated again. This time she looked at the screen and immediately straightened. Another corporate message. She opened it. Her eyes widened. The young employee received one as well. Then another crew member visible through the doorway checked a notification. Within seconds it became obvious that something larger was happening throughout the vessel. Maya noticed it first. Information was spreading again. Fast. Karen carefully looked up from her phone. Corporate leadership has issued a temporary review order. The businessman raised an eyebrow. For what? Karen hesitated. For all customer service actions connected to today's incident. The cabin grew quiet. Naomi showed no reaction. It was almost as if she expected it. Perhaps she did. Karen continued reading. Operations has requested statements from employees, witnesses, and supervisors. Maya looked up immediately. The veteran did too. The teacher folded her magazine completely. Weaknesses. The word changed everything. This was no longer a disagreement. It was now an official review. Richard suddenly stood. Not aggressively. Used abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You are acting like some major violation occurred." Nobody answered immediately. Then the teacher spoke. "A woman with a valid seat was asked to leave because people made assumptions about her. That sounds important to me." The businessman nodded. "To me as well." The veteran added, "and to corporate apparently." Richard looked around and realized he was alone. Completely alone. The room that had once silently accepted his confidence now openly questioned it. Naomi watched the moment unfold without satisfaction or anger. Used observation. She had learned long ago that truth eventually did the work itself. The display screen near the entrance refreshed again. New text appeared beneath the corporate logo. Executive Leadership Welcome Event scheduled upon arrival. Additional details forthcoming. Maya stared at the screen. "They are preparing for you." Naomi smiled faintly. "It appears so." The young employee suddenly stepped forward. "Ms. Brooks?" Naomi looked up. "Yes." His voice trembled slightly. "I wanted to apologize too." The room turned toward him. "I was not involved in the seating decision," he continued. "But I saw people making assumptions and I did not speak up." The statement surprised everyone. Especially Karen. The employee looked embarrassed but determined. "I should have said something sooner." Naomi studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thank you for saying that." The relief on his face was immediate. Maya smiled. The veteran smiled too. Sometimes courage arrived late. It still mattered. Outside the windows, the harbor was becoming visible in the distance. Buildings rose against the horizon. Docks. Cranes. Terminal structures. The destination was approaching quickly now. Inside the cabin, however, another destination had already been reached. The truth was no longer hidden. The assumptions were no longer protected. And for the first time since boarding the ferry, every person in the room was looking at Naomi Brooks exactly as they should have from the beginning. Not because she was a billionaire. Not because she was the new chief executive officer. But because she was a person whose dignity should never have depended on any of those things. The harbor grew larger with every passing minute. Through the panoramic windows, passengers could now see cranes rising above the waterfront, tugboats crossing the channel, and terminal buildings waiting along the shoreline. The ferry was nearing the end of its journey. Inside the VIP cabin, however, a different journey was still unfolding. The truth had surfaced, but its consequences were only beginning. Karen Whitmore's phone continued receiving notifications. She no longer tried to hide them. Every few moments another message appeared. Corporate requests. Operational directives. Meeting notices. The company was moving quickly. Much faster than anyone had anticipated. Naomi Brooks remained seated, watching the harbor approach. Her expression was calm, but her attention never drifted. She noticed everything. The nervous glances. The whispered conversations. The employees checking their devices. Years of leadership had taught her that important moments often revealed themselves through small details. Maya Torres looked around the cabin and realized something remarkable. Earlier that afternoon, nearly everyone had accepted Karen's decision without question. Now the same people were analyzing every part of it. The shift was impossible to ignore. The businessman finally spoke. "I keep thinking about something." Several passengers looked toward him. What if nobody had recognized her? Silence followed. The veteran slowly nodded. That is exactly the right question. The teacher agreed. Because the answer matters. Richard Whitmore stared out the window. He had spoken less and less since the announcement. Every attempt to defend the situation seemed weaker than the last. Naomi looked toward the businessman. The answer should not change. He nodded. No, it should not. A person's dignity cannot depend on whether someone knows their title, Naomi said. Several passengers quietly agreed. Karen listened carefully. Every word seemed directed at a larger lesson rather than a personal grievance. That realization affected her more than she expected. Her phone vibrated again. This time she read the message and immediately closed her eyes for a second. The young employee noticed. What happened? He asked quietly. Karen opened the message again. Corporate has scheduled an emergency leadership review. The room became quiet. Today? Maya asked. Karen nodded. Immediately after arrival. The businessman raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Karen looked down. Very fast. Nobody needed further explanation. Everyone understood what it meant. The company had taken the incident seriously. Extremely seriously. Richard finally turned away from the window. People make mistakes, he said. His voice lacked the certainty it once carried. Naomi looked at him calmly. They do. Richard seemed relieved by the response. Then Naomi continued. The important question is what happens after the mistake becomes visible. Once again, the room fell silent. Richard had no answer. Neither did Karen. The veteran leaned back in his chair. That applies to companies too. Naomi nodded. Especially companies. Outside, another ferry passed in the distance. Sunlight reflected across the water, filling the cabin with a warm glow. For the first time all afternoon, the atmosphere felt less tense. Not because the situation had been forgotten. Because it had been understood. The display screen near the entrance refreshed again. New text appeared beneath the corporate logo. Welcome team preparing executive reception. Arrival procedures active. Maya smiled when she saw it. They really are waiting for you. Naomi laughed softly. Apparently they are. The young employee checked his tablet and looked surprised. The terminal staff has already been notified. Karen glanced toward him. How many people know? At this point? He looked at the screen. Probably everyone. A few passengers laughed quietly. Even the teacher smiled. The irony was impossible to miss. The woman who had spent the afternoon being questioned was now the person every employee in the company was preparing to welcome. Karen took a slow breath and finally stepped closer to Naomi. There is something I need to tell you. Naomi looked up. Karen hesitated before continuing. The review team requested witness statements. Naomi nodded. That makes sense. Karen looked around the room. Several passengers have already volunteered to provide them. Maya immediately raised her hand. The veteran did the same. Then the businessman. Then the teacher. One by one, witnesses openly confirmed what they had seen. Karen looked genuinely humbled by the response. Nobody was exaggerating. Nobody was attacking anyone. They were simply telling the truth. And sometimes the truth carried more weight than any argument ever could. The shoreline continued drawing closer. Dock workers were now visible in the distance. The ferry would arrive soon. Very soon. Naomi glanced through the window one more time before looking back at the passengers around her. What began as an ordinary trip had become something much larger. Not because she was a billionaire. Not because she was the new chief executive officer. But because an entire room of strangers had witnessed how quickly assumptions could distort fairness. And because those same strangers had chosen to speak when the truth finally came into view. The ferry eased toward the terminal with a low mechanical hum, slowing as dock lines were prepared along the waterfront. Through the windows, passengers could see employees gathering near the arrival area. At first it looked ordinary. Then more people appeared. Managers. Supervisors. Corporate representatives. The welcome team described on the display screen was clearly real. Inside the VIP cabin, every phone seemed active. Messages continued flowing across the company network. Karen Whitmore checked another notification and felt her stomach tighten. The review process was already underway. Not next week. Not after paperwork. Now. The company had moved faster than anyone expected. Naomi Brooks remained seated for another moment, watching the shoreline draw closer. The veteran smiled. Looks like they are rolling out the red carpet. Naomi laughed softly. I hope they are rolling out better policies. Several passengers smiled. The teacher nodded in agreement. That is probably the right priority. Maya Torres looked through the glass toward the terminal. There must be 50 people out there already. The young employee checked his tablet. Closer to 70. Richard Whitmore followed their gaze. For the first time all afternoon, he seemed to understand the full scale of what had happened. This was not merely a successful investor. This was the new leader of the entire organization. The same organization whose authority he had casually invoked earlier in the day. The irony was impossible to escape. Karen's phone rang once more. She answered immediately. Karen Whitmore speaking. She listened silently. Her expression shifted from anxiety to resignation. I understand, she said. Yes. I will cooperate fully. She ended the call and stood quietly for several seconds. Nobody rushed her. Finally she looked toward Naomi. Corporate has placed me on administrative review pending investigation. The words landed heavily in the room. Naomi nodded slowly. I see. Karen took a deep breath. They are also reviewing supervisory decisions related to today's incident. The businessman leaned back in his seat. That seems appropriate. Karen nodded. There was no argument left. Only accountability. Across the cabin, another notification appeared on the employee's tablet. His eyes widened. There is more. Everyone looked toward him. Corporate has suspended discretionary seating override authority company-wide. Until procedures are reviewed. The veteran laughed softly. That happened quickly. The employee nodded. Apparently the new leadership team wants immediate changes. Nobody needed clarification regarding who that leadership team was. Maya smiled toward Naomi. You have not even stepped off the ferry yet. Naomi looked out the window. Sometimes the first day is the most important day. The teacher nodded. Because it sets the standard. Exactly, Naomi replied. The ferry finally reached the dock. Crew members secured the vessel. Outside, corporate representatives were already waiting near the terminal entrance. Through the glass, passengers could see people checking watches, reviewing tablets, and preparing for the arrival. The display screen refreshed one final time. Welcome CEO Naomi Brooks. Building the future together. The message remained visible above the cabin. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Richard stood slowly. He looked toward Naomi. The confidence that once defined his posture was gone. I owe you an apology as well. Naomi met his eyes. Richard hesitated before continuing. I made assumptions about you before I knew anything about you. The room remained silent. Naomi listened carefully. And I contributed to what happened. Richard lowered his gaze. That was wrong. Naomi considered his words. Then she nodded once. The important thing is what you do after recognizing it. Richard quietly accepted the answer. There was no dramatic confrontation. No humiliation. Used the uncomfortable clarity that arrives when truth removes every excuse. Outside, terminal staff began opening the boarding exit. Passengers gathered their belongings. Yet many remained where they were, unwilling to leave before seeing the end of the story they had witnessed unfold. Maya looked around the cabin. You know, this entire thing started because people thought they knew who belonged in a certain seat. The veteran smiled. And ended with everyone learning a much bigger lesson. The teacher added, a lesson some people spend their entire lives learning. Naomi stood for the first time since the confrontation began. The room instinctively grew quiet. Not because of her title. Because of the example she had set come under pressure. Dignity without arrogance. Strength without hostility. She picked up her tablet and phone, then looked once around the cabin. Every face reflected a different emotion. Reflection. Relief. Respect. Accountability. Drought. The journey across the water was ending. But for many people in that room, a different journey had just begun. One that would stay with them long after they left the ferry behind. Naomi Brooks stepped toward the exit as the ferry completed its docking procedures. The doors had not opened yet, but through the glass she could already see rows of employees waiting near the terminal entrance. Some held tablets. Others wore company badges and formal jackets. Several members of the board stood together near the front. The welcome was clearly prepared in a hurry, yet the respect behind it was genuine. Inside the VIP cabin, passengers gathered their belongings slowly, reluctant to leave before witnessing the final chapter of what had unfolded. Maya Torres smiled as she watched Naomi. I have a feeling people are going to be talking about this day for a very long time. Naomi laughed softly. I hope they remember the lesson more than the story. The veteran nodded immediately. That is exactly what they should remember. The teacher agreed. Because the lesson applies everywhere. The ferry doors finally opened. Cool ocean air drifted into the cabin. Terminal staff stood ready outside. As Naomi stepped forward, something unexpected happened. The passengers who had witnessed everything began standing one by one. First the veteran. Then the teacher. Then the businessman. Then Maya. Within moments nearly everyone in the cabin was on their feet. Not because a billionaire was leaving. Not because a chief executive officer had arrived. Because they had spent the afternoon watching someone respond to unfair treatment with dignity instead of bitterness. Naomi paused briefly. She looked around the cabin one last time. Thank you, she said simply. The passengers applauded softly. Not loud enough to create a spectacle. Used enough to express respect. Karen Whitmore stood near the aisle. She looked nervous, humbled, and thoughtful all at once. Naomi stopped beside her. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Karen finally said, I am sorry for how I handled today. Naomi studied her expression. The apology sounded different now. Not defensive. Not strategic. Honest. What matters most is what happens next, Naomi replied. Karen nodded. I understand. Naomi offered a small smile and continued toward the exit. Richard Whitmore remained near the window. He stood as she approached. I was wrong about you, he admitted quietly. Naomi shook her head. You were wrong about more than me. Richard lowered his eyes. He understood exactly what she meant. Naomi continued walking. Outside, dozens of employees straightened as she appeared. Cameras from internal communications teams were visible near the terminal. Corporate representatives moved forward. Yet before any formal greeting could begin, Naomi turned back toward the passengers still standing inside the cabin. Her voice carried clearly across the quiet terminal entrance. The seat was never the issue. The words immediately captured everyone's attention. Employees. Passengers. Managers. Board members. Everyone listened. The issue was deciding who deserved it before knowing anything about the person sitting there. Complete silence followed. Naomi looked around at the faces before her. Some embarrassed. Some inspired. Some reflective. Too many people spend their lives being underestimated because of how they look, where they come from, how they dress, or what others assume about them. The veteran nodded. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. Naomi continued. The solution is not simply treating successful people with respect. The solution is treating everyone with respect. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth stood on its own. Naomi glanced toward the harbor. Sunlight reflected across the water where the journey had begun only hours earlier. Then she looked back toward the crowd. Character is revealed when there is no title attached. No recognition. No spotlight. Just another human being standing in front of you. Karen lowered her gaze. Richard did the same. Several employees exchanged thoughtful looks. Naomi smiled gently. Today was never a test of status. It was a test of character. The words settled over the terminal like a final answer. Then she turned and continued toward the waiting executives. The board members stepped forward to greet their new chief executive officer. Employees applauded. Cameras flashed. Corporate representatives extended their hands. Yet behind all the attention, the most important change had already happened. Not in a boardroom. Not in a contract. Not in an acquisition. It happened inside a ferry cabin where strangers learned that dignity should never depend on wealth, power, position, or recognition. And as Naomi Brooks disappeared into the crowd waiting to welcome her, the lesson remained behind, carried by every person who had witnessed the journey from assumption to truth.